Welcome to episode 52 of the Rescued by Dragons fantasy fiction podcast, Tales of the Brunch Club. My name is Brian Messmer, and I'm not only your storyteller, but the dungeon master behind the homebrew Dungeons & Dragons campaign this adventure is based on. Please join me as I tell the tale of how my players and the dice ruined and improved my perfectly laid plans. But first, a quick recap. At camp, a familiar snow-white goose approached the Brunch Club and stole an egg from the party. Before the goose slipped away, Sam identified the creature as a level 10 magic being, Salus and Drusilla being magic level 3 for comparison. They continued their travels through the mountains. A rock's distant cry set off an avalanche, which enveloped Diesa, Jory, Alora, and Salus. With the help of Copper, a bell, and loud screams, the party dug up their companions one by one. They rested and continued the push toward the peak the next day. There, they came upon a frost giant and two ogres at the mouth of a cave. The frost giant pushed one of the monsters into the cave, and hours later, it was ejected from its depths with several arrows piercing its skin, dead. The remaining frost giant and ogre retreated from the cave, spotted the group, and attacked. The Brunch Club defended themselves, killing the two large attackers. The group decided to investigate the cave, and entered with caution. Inside was a lush pine forest filled with streams and waterfalls and inhabited by small woodland creatures. Drusilla cast Speak with Animals. Two cardinals informed her that Gulu, a beautiful elf of ice and snow, was in charge. When they found the elf, Sam began to hum and, as if compelled to do so, stepped through a shimmering archway behind the creature. The group then explained the reason for their arrival to the archfey standing before them, including their misgivings about Rajat. Gulu, who was not an archfey, but this touchpoint's fey guardian, offered to deal with Rajat, but only in exchange for amusement, in the form of a creature of chaos. And now, episode 52. Honk first, roll later. Not only did the party need to figure out how to catch a goose, but one that was a much more powerful magic creature, and had evaded any attempts to capture it or harm it thus far. They discussed what they knew about the goose, that it was surely an agent of chaos, and that it seemed to have an affinity for shiny cooking utensils. Beyond that, the elusive goose was a mystery. It's a good start, Drusilla mused, as Jory emptied cooking utensils from his bag onto the cavern floor. He carefully arranged them in a pattern, driving the spatula into the ground at the center so that it stood upright. Drusilla fished through her pack, seeking any items with extra shimmer. She withdrew her freshly harvested bahir scales with delight. She placed them leading from the arrangement of cooking utensils toward the mouth of the cave. When she had completed her task, she looked around, looking for any creature she might be able to turn spy. Spotting a pair of blue jays, Drusilla scoffed. Ugh, blue jays are such dicks, she thought to herself, and continued to survey for an animal with which she could converse. Soon, she spotted a lone chipmunk as it scurried down the base of a nearby pine. Hello, Mr. Chipmunk. I was wondering if I could ask you a favor? The chipmunk stared at the elf, and Drusilla continued. In exchange for snacks, of course. I like snacks, the chipmunk exclaimed, its furry tail twitching in anticipation. Okay, if you see a goose come in here, can you please come and let me know immediately? Then you can have snacks. Okay, was all it said, before reaching its hands out for the immediate delivery of said snacks. Drusilla fished out a piece of beef jerky, promising more later and asking for his name. It was Chip. Nearby, Salus wandered the pine forest aimlessly, examining the flora and fauna of the strange, cavernous ecosystem they found themselves in. Suddenly, she heard Pip's voice ringing deeply in her mind. Sup, baby girl? Salus knew the comment wasn't directed at her, but was unable to stop hearing Pip's avian flirtation. Big things come in small packages, baby, he continued. Salus spun around to see her familiar scooting closer toward a horned owl. The horned owl rotated its head towards Pip. She let loose a demure hoot before flying away to escape Pip's unwanted advances. Once Jory had completed his goose lure, he took a deep swig of his Boda bag and approached Gulu, who stood stoically in front of the portal to the Feywild. Jory teetered briefly and, with the unpolished bravery of a town drunk at a bar, he asked, So, you just Stand there all the time? Gulu glanced down at Jory. Yes, I guard the portal. How long have you been here? Jory asked. Longer than you have, the snow elf responded. Jory paused, considering the verity of this answer. He shuffled his feet in the snow for a moment. I have a question, Jory started. You seem to have many, Gulu responded. Jory flashed a large, nervous grin. Well, you seem powerful, and I was wondering if you would perhaps be able to restore Laura's memories? He gazed up at the Fae, hopeful for his companion. That skill is not something based on raw power. I sadly lack the capability, Gulu responded. Do you know what could have happened to my friend to make her lose her memory after going to the Fae? She's an elf. That shouldn't happen, right? I don't know. Do you mind if I ask another question? Jory asked, and Gulu nodded. I have a lot of time to stand here, Jory. Ask away. Right. Good point. My friends think they might possibly be interested in going to the Fae, but they're, way more powerful than I am. I'm just a drunk who knows where to punch people. I don't think I belong in the Feywild. Ulu's hardened, icy face seemed to soften slightly, the corners of their lips teasing a smile. Well, if you come to me seeking wisdom, there are much better places to seek this out. But I do believe you should consider your options with trepidation. Drusilla approached Jory and Gulu, having heard the tail end of the conversation as she returned to the camp. Would you let us, she asked as she approached, go to the Feywild, that is? Would you let Alora and I in? Gulu considered a moment. If you uphold your end of the bargain, yes, but safety I cannot promise. What kind of dangers are in the Fae? Drusilla asked, curious. It's much like the world you know, Gulu stated, their gaze boring into Drusilla's eyes. But twisted. This is neither good nor bad, but things in the Feywild tend not to be what they seem. Have you seen Alora come through this portal before? Jory asked, both he and Drusilla awaiting an answer with rapt attention. The ranger? No, I have not seen her before. Just curious, I guess, Jory sighed, his shoulders hunched. Curiosity is the natural order. Now, my turn. Why are you all here together? What path led you to me, to this cave? Asked Gulu. Salis approached from the forest with Pip perched grumpily on her shoulder. We've been on very different journeys, but we found one another during our travels. One by one, we formed a sort of family. Most of us were seeking information from the library in Elnor, but I think we needed one another to help us along our journey. How quaint, Gulu responded, the snow elf looking a bit forlorn as they said. It does get a bit lonely here. The conversation continued, soon devolving into Jory extending a drunken invitation to Gulu to join their party. Gulu respectfully declined, but seemed amused by the offer. Gulu also explained that they were in fact not an archfey, but rather an eladrin, a type of winter elf. They seemed to reflect both in Gulu's appearance and icy demeanor, and they explained that they need no nourishment but cold winter air. The hours passed slowly, the party anxiously awaiting for an agent of chaos to join their midst. Several hours passed before a grumbling emanated from Jory's stomach. Abashedly, he asked Gulu if the Eladra knew of any foods they could consume in the cave that wouldn't harm the flora and fauna that she looked after. Strawberries, they replied. From the distance, a familiar voice cried, I fucking love strawberries! Gulu turned their attention to Diesa as she stepped out from behind a tree. Why eavesdrop, dwarf, when you could just join the conversation? Habits, Diesa shrugged. Where the strawberries at? Gulu gestured toward an outcropping of hay in the distance. The strawberries are that way, they explained, and the group left to investigate. They were surprised to find no red, luscious berries. Instead, they found a patch of hay-like grass. Drusilla and Diesa glanced at one another, befuddled. They parted the grass, wandered aimlessly, and scoffed. There were no strawberry bushes to be seen. When Salis joined the hunt, she was equally fruitless. "Is Gulu trying to mess with us? This stinks," Diesa scoffed, kicking at the hay. Defeated, they all headed back toward Gulu. "We didn't see any strawberries," Drusilla exclaimed, and Gulu looked puzzled. "You were standing in them." "What?" Diesa asked, looking back toward the patch of hay. "Strawberries. Why do you think they're called that?" I think we call them something else outside the cave," Jory explained, puzzled. Drusilla strode back up toward the straw, which snapped as she tore off several stalks. The centers were a deep bluish-purple pulp, which oozed slightly when they were broken. Emboldened by her resistance to poison, Diesa was the first to taste the fruit that Gulu called strawberries. The stalk crunched between her teeth, and soon the familiar, overwhelming taste of rosemary and baked garlic coated her tongue. As the party members tried the purple pulp, they each encountered a different taste. Diesa breathed at Jory. Smell my breath," she exclaimed. Jory paused a moment, after reluctantly inhaling, pondering. "It smells like watermelon," he responded, confused. To Alora and Drusilla, the elves, it tasted quite like an actual strawberry. To Salis, it tasted a bit like ginger. With more time to spare, the group foraged for other foods to try within the cave. Jory located what Gulu had described as parsnips, collecting a root vegetable that actually snipped at Jory's hands as he drew them from the ground. He fought them into submission, preparing them to cook. As he laid the first parsnip into a hot frying pan, it released a high-pitched screech that reverberated through the cave. Parsnips, they found, tasted a bit like lobster. When night fell, the cavern was illuminated by glowing mushrooms and sparkling water. No goose arrived, nor did it arrive the next day. They continued to keep watch, but to no avail. Bored and frustrated, Alora marched to the mouth of the cave, and her companions hurried after her. She looked back at them and drew a deep breath, cupping her hands around her mouth. "Honk!" she screamed into the snowy oblivion, an echo reverberating through the mountainside. Although she sounded much like a goose, nothing seemed to come of her cry. Defeated, they decided to use their free time to call Rajat and inform him of their whereabouts. Through their sending stones, Alora said, "Checking in. Found it. We'll be back to meet you in Route Run." After a pause, a deep, curt voice responded, "Thank you for the update." And then silence. Diesa huffed as she passed alongside the fire, grumpy and impatient to locate the goose. She was growing bored. As a thought struck her, she halted, smiling. "I have a brilliant idea." She marched toward Jory, grabbing him by the arm. "What if we hang Jory upside down at the mouth of the cave?" "What?" Jory cried as he looked at Diesa in horror, while Alora, Salis, and Drusilla stared at the two of them, considering the idea. Salis crossed her arms and shrugged. "Nothing better to do, I guess." Diesa took off running toward the mouth of the cave, Jory in tow. The dwarf fashioned a pulley using her rope and pitons and attached it to the roof of the cave. With a spatula and bell in hand, Jory allowed Diesa to hoist him by his feet up to the ceiling. "Why do I have to be upside down?" Jory asked, as he felt the blood begin rushing to his head. "It's sillier," Diesa answered, without further explanation. "You guys will keep an eye out for me, though, right?" "Right, of course. Yeah, nothing could go wrong," Diesa assured the drunken halfling while stifling her laughter. The companions stood a ways back, laughing as they watched Jory wriggling and twisting in the air, the bell jingling softly. Goose!" Jory cried, ringing the bell. For 10 minutes, he yelled into the void. As the minutes passed, Jory grew more and more uncomfortable and lightheaded. When he first heard a soft crunching in the snow, he wasn't sure if he was just imagining it. It wasn't until he saw a familiar, white-feathered creature with orange beak approach the mouth of the cave that he exclaimed with joy, Guys! Guys, it worked!" He shouted as the goose waddled toward him, gazing up at the suspended halfling with its head cocked to the side. "Honk!" the goose cried as it eyed Jory, and then again as it looked at Diesa holding the rope at the other end. Abruptly, the goose flew at Jory, snatching the spatula from his hand with its beak. Diesa let go of the rope, dropping Jory 10 feet to the ground with a thud. The goose flew over the heads of Elora, Drusilla, and Salis and into the cave. The three ran after the goose, followed closely by Jory. Diesa chose to hang back, waiting to see if the goose would try to escape. From the cave entrance she heard the subterranean forest erupt into a cacophony of bird cries. Deeper in the cavern, Gulu watched the goose as it flew aimlessly around the cavern, honking. "Mr. or Madam Goose, please come down. I would very much like to speak with you," Gulu said calmly, and the goose honked as it landed at Gulu's feet. It dropped the spatula and honked once more. Gulu smiled as the party frantically ran toward them. "Have you ever tried just asking the goose to speak with you?" Breathless and in awe, the party members scoffed. They most certainly had. "Goose, can you shake your tail feathers?" The goose looked at Gulu and then back at the party. With a honk, the goose began to wiggle its tail feathers just slightly. "Well, this goose is fantastic," Gulu mused, laughing. As he laughed, the goose's form began to change. The feathers shimmered as they shifted into a glorious white cape, and he began to transform from a goose into a stout halfling man. He wore an enormous orange topaz necklace around his neck and a finely tailored gray suit. The halfling's gray-blue eyes shone with amusement. He had a glorious head of gray-white hair swept neatly back against his scalp. "Well, isn't this fun?" the former goose cried and clapped his hands. He looked at the party and then to Gulu. "I have to say I was quite fond of the scale trick you tried to pull, but when you hung your companion upside down from the roof of a cave, well, I just couldn't resist coming to say hello. Very silly indeed, very clever." "Who are you?" Elora cried, her companions struggling to regain their composure from the shock of seeing the goose transformed into a fully communicative halfling. Jory couldn't help but think that this goose being need not have defecated all over his sleeping quarters those many weeks ago. Ignoring the question, the halfling looked at Drusilla. "Oh, and you can tell your dwarven companion that I will not be trying to fly out of the cave. She can come join us if she would like." Drusilla called to Diesa, and a few minutes later she emerged, running and breathless. As she drew nearer and noticed the strange man that had materialized in the cavern, a look of confusion fell across her face. "What the—" Diesa started, as she stopped in her tracks. "It's me, the goose, Honk," he called as he glanced at Elora. "Nice effort, quite an entertaining goose call you have. I think it sounded a tad bit more like a southern goose, but you near had me fooled. Anyway," he continued with a grin, "you can call me Shibu. Why have you beckoned me here so desperately?" "Well, Gulu wanted to meet you," Drusilla explained, and Shibu glanced at the stoic winter elf. "Oh, pleasure to meet you, Gulu. Is that all, then?" "Well, now I just need to know, why have you been messing with us all this time?" Drusilla asked, and Shibu shrugged. "Because it's fun. And you just do this to us?" "Don't flatter yourselves, I do this to everyone. Some call me a creator, an undying one, a demigod, or some just a god. If you recall, I took a great deal of pleasure in messing with some pirates you once knew." Shibu smiled to himself, recounting the memory. "And I believe one of you singed me. Not very civil, was it?" Shibu continued as he looked at Drusilla. "You and your Raven Queen. She was never very fond of me, that one. Takes herself quite seriously. She never wants to have any fun." "This is—" Jory started, searching for the right words. "Fantastic, I know," Shibu exclaimed, incorrectly finishing Jory's sentence. He clapped his hands together once more. "So, I'm a bit of a trickster myself," Diesa vainly explained to the demigod. "What kind of moves do you have?" Shibu glanced at Diesa. "Ever tried this?" Squatting, the bright-eyed halfling began to, very mundanely, wiggle his arms in the motion of a wave. Diesa furrowed her brow, but said nothing. "How long have you been doing this?" Jory asked. "Oh, just about a minute now," Shibu called as he continued to wiggle his arms. "Oh, I'm just being facetious, little one. Do you mean to ask how long I've been wandering the plains, often as a goose, deploying chaotic tricks on innocent strangers?" Jory nodded. 372 years, 8 months, and 22 days, roughly. The group pondered this, and asked Shibu whether this was how he had always lived. He explained that before becoming Shibu, the god of trickery, he was just a regular halfling that grew up on a goose farm with an affinity for tricks and messing with others. There have been Shibus before me, he explained. The previous Shibu was a bit more malicious than I am. I just like to shit in people's rooms when they make fun of me. By the way, Jory, my nose is not that big. I saw how you portrayed me in that beef jerky portrait. Anyway, where was I? Ah, yes, my predecessor. He was a right prick. He would steal people's faces and become them. He would sneak up behind his victim, and they would be all like, "Oh my!" and Shibu would be like, "Ha ha!" and he would take your face, and you would become a faceless, lifeless lump of goo. Shibu would then become you. Well, Shibu. But in your face. Jory considered this. So, how did you become Shibu? Excellent question. While I am now quite literally a god, I was never religious in my previous life. But I heard of this Shibu trickster, and like any reasonable halfling would, I decided to prank the trickster god. I played a wonderful, helpless little halfling. "Oh, it's me, I'm a helpless goose farmer's son with a pretty face." And then I went into the hay barn, and Shibu followed. When he snuck up on me, he knew not that I had taken my mother's looking-glass. I devised a contraption to put it in front of my face, and when I turned, Shibu saw his own face in the reflection, effectively stealing his own face. The demigod laughed boisterously, as if he had just delivered the most spectacular punchline. Recovering from his laughter, he said, "Now Shibu is me." "Does anyone worship you?" Diesa asked, eyeing Shibu. "Oh, a few. Would you like to? I could use more followers." "What is the method of worship?" "Oh, I don't know. Trick people? Nothing crass, of course. I'm not fond of stealing faces." A few moments of silence passed as the group considered the development the day had brought them. They caught the goose, who was not actually a goose, and found out that he was a god that took pleasure in nothing more than creating chaos and confusion in his wake. "So you're a god," Alora began, as a thought crept into her mind. Yeah. "Can you restore memories?" she asked. And Shibu raised an eyebrow at the elf, a glimmer in his eye. "Yes, but I'd like something in exchange." "Worship." Alora paused. "What does that entail?" Before Shibu could answer, Drusilla suggested it meant that she needs to honk nightly before bed. Shibu clapped his hands. "Yes, that does it now. Every night, no matter who you are with, I insist you honk loudly before you rest, thrice. You also need to take some things that don't belong to you and still confusion unto others, and please just don't be dark and mellow and bleh about everything. I like my worshippers to be happy, light, and bubbly." "Suspicious," Diesa cut in. "How do we know you'll restore Alora's memory as it was?" "You don't. I'm the trickster god," Shibu responded with a wink. "Alora, I just need you to say, 'I love you, Shibu, restore my memory, I trust you completely,' and we can get on with it." The group faltered, considering the option, and the very real possibility that Shibu would find a way to turn Alora's memory restoration into a trick somehow. Drusilla turned her attention to Gulu. "Gulu, did this satisfy your request?" "Oh yes, above and beyond my wildest expectations," Gulu responded with a glint in their eye. The snow elf was deriving much pleasure from simply watching the exchange unfold between Shibu and the Brunch Club. Drusilla nodded in agreement, turning her attention back to Shibu. "Shibu, I ask this very respectfully, but may I have a feather from your cloak?" Shibu scoffed. "No! May I have a feather from your raven queen?" "I don't have that power," Drusilla cried, aghast. "How unimaginative. Can you try?" Shibu pleaded, like a child begging for treats. He skipped toward Drusilla and took her hands in his. "Pray with me," he exclaimed. "How do you start? Do you honk?" Drusilla wavered, finally relenting. "I guess we can try to contact her." Drusilla began to pray to her god. "Raven Queen, we are in the strangest situation. We've met the goose god Shibu and god of trickery," he interjected. "God of trickery," Drusilla repeated after him. "The undying one," he continued. The undying one. Oh, and add that I'm a fabulous dancer." Drusilla shot Shibu a look, but continued. "And he is a most fabulous dancer. He would really like to meet you, and like I said, we're in a bit of a strange situation." Moments passed in silence. Raven Queen, Shibu called, his voice ringing out through the cavern. If you can hear me, I just wanted to say, you're kind of a bitch. Shibu wiped his hands against one another, pleased with himself. I do hope she was listening. Shibu ran a hand along the side of his cloak, and plucked a single white feather with a touch of gray, handing it to Drusilla. Put it to good use, he said, winking at the elf. She nodded, and set the feather into her bag of holding. So, are we just going to have a slumber party until Rajat gets here? Shibu asked. He plopped himself onto the cabin floor childishly, and looked up at the group, expectant for an answer. Well, we were going to bring a map back to him to show him where the touch point is, Joy exclaimed, and Shibu yawned dramatically. Boring, he sang. Would you like me to just portal the crazy druid here? You know Rajat? Salas asked. Of course I do. Like I said, he's crazy. And not the fun great Aunt Nancy showed up to the winter festival with 2 blunts and a bottle of gin crazy. He's a bit more like Uncle Jimmy with an axe yelling at everyone and chasing the goats crazy, and no one really wants to tell him to stop because they might, die. Anyway, Shibu laughed. Would you like me to restore your memory, Alora? The elf paused, taking a deep breath. She'd been chasing her memories for so long, and was surprised at how uncertain she felt, now faced with the opportunity to learn the truth about who she was. Promise me you won't remove any of my memories? Alora asked Shibu nervously. Pinky promise, Shibu exclaimed, reaching his pinky out toward the elf. They intertwined fingers in an agreement. Now, the rest of you, I need you to dance and honk, please. It will help me focus. They began to honk, dancing about the cave as Gulu watched. His face was still, but his eyes shimmered in amusement. Shibu gestured to Alora to kneel, and as she did so, he rested a hand on her forehead, closing his eyes to concentrate. An uncomfortable sensation rushed through Alora's head, and her eyes began to water. The back of her head pounded as memories came flooding back to her in overwhelming waves. She remembered that she was born in the jungles of Tenoctitlan. She remembered a childhood filled with passion toward folklore and stories of monsters, growing up to love the challenge of the hunt. A vignette of hunt seemed to play across her mind, portraying a young Alora battling monsters and developing her skills with a bow, all to help those that were powerless against the beasts plaguing them. Alora remembered leaving her home and traveling Twel, and eventually meeting a group of like-minded adventurers to form a hunting party, the Obsidian Watch. She remembered hunting a powerful vampire named Tepesh Torgavishta, who had been posing as a powerful noble in the court of the Drazanian Empire. While on the hunt for the vampire, Alora and her party traveled to the Bloodwood Forest to gain information about Tepesh. Here, they inquired with wood elves and met Rajat. During her stay in the forest, Rajat continuously pursued Alora's affections, making unwelcome advances and trying to gain her favor obsessively. Alora remembered her repulsion at the sight of him, and the need to continuously and aggressively deny his pursuits. Crashing a party flush with aristocrats and attempting to kill the vampire by poisoning his drink, which failed. Following the vampire back to his estate, they laid a trap for him. The plan failed as the vampire had been aware that there was someone or something on his trail. The vampire vanquished 2 of her companions, Alexis Sinclair and Bearclaw, and knocked Alora unconscious. She remembered awakening in his dungeon, chained to the wall. There, the vampire drew out her memories one by one, consuming them and using them to gain power. When he had had his fill of her memories, he banished her to the Feywild. There, Alora was sent on quests by the Fae to gain their favor, and they eventually agreed to send her back to her home plane, ejecting her into the Sable Forest. As the memories came flooding back, tears streamed down Alora's face. She stood shakily. "Oh my God," she whispered in shock. You might want to take a moment to process," Shibu said gently, looking at Alora with knowing eyes. "No," Alora responded immediately. "I want to see Rajat. Now." The Brunch Club formed a circle, preparing for the trickster god to deliver Rajat to the cavern. "Shibu, will you help us if it gets combative?" Drusilla asked, and Shibu shook his head. "Goodness, no," he responded, and then the trickster god began to concentrate. Although he remained physically in the cavern, it was clear his presence was elsewhere. "Would you like to teleport?" he asked, and the Brunch Club heard no reply. Shibu paused a moment. Ah, wrong answer. The trickster god bowed and stepped back. Before the Brunch Club materialized the figure of Rajat, squatting and indisposed. He fell backwards and scrambled to retrieve his garments. Shibu stepped away. Nice butt, Jory cried, and Rajat scowled at the halfling. How the hell did I get here? Did you teleport me? His voice was terse and angry, and he flushed when his gaze met Alora's stone-cold stare. We don't have that power, responded Salis, her arms crossed. But it turns out we know some powerful people. Welcome to the portal, Drusilla said, gesturing toward Gulu, and the portal they guarded. Rajat's expression softened. Well done, he said, staring in awe at Gulu. He stepped toward the winter elf, eyes transfixed on the gateway behind them. Not so fast. I believe you owe Alora something, Drusilla called to him, and Rajat paused. Yes, of course, your memories. Rajat took a deep breath. I didn't want to force it on you because you couldn't remember Alora, but when you came to the Bloodwood, you eventually relented to joining me for a romantic evening. And it may seem hard to believe, but we got along very well, and a blossoming romance grew between us. We fell very hard for one another, Alora, and it was so difficult knowing you were back. He looked at Alora with pleading eyes. His voice choked. I was bitter you left me in the Bloodwood, but now we can go to the Feywild together and start a new life. Alora kept her face expressionless, knowing all too well that Rajat was lying outright about their history together. Unable to read her face, Rajat continued, Please think about it, Alora. Take your time, but I want you with me. Alora said nothing. Do you remember at all? Rajat asked. Alora sighed. I can't say it's ringing any bells, the ranger responded, and Drusilla and Salis saw Rajat release a small sigh of relief. But that's probably because none of that ever happened, isn't it, Rajat? Alora finally revealed. Rajat stepped back, placing a hand on his chest, feigning insult. What? It did. No, Rajat. I was disgusted by you. You tried to force your way close to me, and it was pathetic. You lost your memory, Rajat started, and Alora interjected. I got it back. You've been gone 14 days. There's no way you somehow had your memories returned to you in the time since you left me, Rajat exclaimed. I did, said Alora coldly. Rajat looked flustered, grasping for words. You're mistaken. You're wrong. You fell in love. We made love. It was beautiful. Please, Alora, we can go through the portal together. Rajat was now stammering. He reached for Alora and she recoiled, shaking her head. You ignorant bitch, Rajat yelled, suddenly enraged. We could have had something wonderful and you are throwing it away! Hey, yelled Jory, watch yourself. You're outnumbered. It smells like wet stag in here, Salis added, her nose wrinkling. Hey, Gulu, called Alora over her shoulder. Do you think we should let this guy through the portal? Gulu looked Rajat up and down with disdain, and coolly shook their head. I think not. Rajat shook with rage. His grip tightened on his staff, knuckles turning white. Jory noted the familiarity of the staff. They'd seen it once before at Saberhagen's, being shipped to a new owner. The fine craftsmanship and intricate, magical-looking runes stood out to him. Jory reacted quickly, perhaps hastily. He ran toward Rajat and landed a flurry of punches while aiming for a cluster of nerves on his back. 2 hits missed, but a third connected. The surprised and unarmored Rajat stood stunned and helpless before him. Jory swung once more at Rajat, striking him across the face in anger. That's for lying to my friend! Drusilla grinned, anxious to attack the malicious, disgusting druid before her. Her hands glowed as she cast Guiding Bolt, which struck him with brutal force. The silver-black ray of energy exploded into his shoulder, tearing through flesh and muscle. Rajat staggered back, grasping. Diasa stared at the stunned, wounded Rajat and loaded her crossbow. She first grabbed a regular bolt, and quickly thought to herself, that won't do, will it? She drew another instead, a bolt dipped in poison. Smirking, and only a few feet away from Rajat, she raised her aim and locked her gaze onto his wide, fearful eyes. The bolt dove into his clavicle, and blood spurted from the wound. Diesa almost reached for another bolt, but decided to relinquish her opportunity for another shot. Instead, she gestured to Alora. "Alora, take this guy, yeah?" Alora nodded back at her companion, turning her gaze to Rajat. Her eyes were intense as she grabbed her phoenix arrow from her pack. She touched her finger to its fine tip, a droplet of blood forming. She smiled, satisfied. "I just sharpened it. I don't take very kindly to manipulation, you see. You tried to destroy towns filled with innocent people just to get my attention. You tried to lie to me to convince me to be with you. Rajat, you just might be the most vile monster I've ever had the pleasure of killing. You're definitely the most pathetic." She smirked as she set the phoenix arrow aflame. Rajat, still stunned, whimpered in fear. Alora drew back her bow and shot the first flaming arrow into the druid's chest. She drew a second arrow, aiming a little higher. It drove directly into his eye socket, and he crumpled to the ground. The arrow returned itself to Alora's quiver. Rajat crumpled. "But you loved me," he said weakly, then died on the forest floor. Alora sat down, catching her breath, and Drusilla stepped toward her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Are you okay?" she asked. Alora shook her head. "I really don't know." Salas turned to Gulu. "How's that for interesting?" The ice elf smiled wryly. "I've gotten much more than I bargained for from the Brunch Club." Drusilla grabbed Rajat's staff, putting it in the bag of holding with their other possessions. Meanwhile, Joy checked for other items, finding a series of ingredients, powders, and dried mushrooms in his possessions. "What should we do with the body?" they asked, and agreed the easiest method of disposal would be to toss his body into the Feywild. "You wanted to go to the Feywild," Diesa shrugged, and they agreed it would only be right to deliver him. Together, Jory and Diesa hoisted his body through the portal. Shibu sat atop one of the henges, his toes dangling down from above. He called down to the party. "Oh, you devious little minxes! A bit dark for my taste, but quite creative. Imagine an elf just wandering through the Fey, and plop! Down falls Rajat's body, out of the blue. How chaotic." Shibu mused, a smile on his face. "What splendid worshippers I have." Shibu," Drusilla asked cautiously, "any chance you could teleport us back home?" The trickster god smiled. "Yes. Are you all ready?" They nodded, bracing to be teleported. "Thank you, Gulu, and thank you, Shibu," they cried, and Shibu clapped. Very briefly, everything went dark, and the 6 members of the Brunch Club experienced the sensation of falling. They landed on their backs, groaning as they propped themselves up from their fallen position. The party found themselves in a dark, wet cave. The air was cold, and they could hear wind howling outside of the cavern. When Drusilla cast dancing lights to illuminate the cave, they noticed a steel humanoid figure lying on its back. Its body was covered in crystals and etched with dwarven writing. "Sam!" Alora cried out and ran toward him. She knelt down, but he was dark and silent. Salas noticed a drawing etched into one of the cave's stone walls. It was a crude but recognizable drawing of a robot holding hands with an elf with a bow. Next to them were figures of another elf, a dwarf, a halfling, a gnome, and a giant pygmy owl. Beneath the figures, written in Dwarvish, was the word, "Friends." "Guys," Jory whispered, his voice wavering with fear, "I think we're in the Feywild." At least that's what the party thinks, and have thought for the 10 months since we were last able to play. I figured as the Dungeon Master, since we don't know when we'll be able to play in person next, now is as good a time as ever to tell them that they are not in the Feywild. I let them stew on it since they decided to let the god of trickery teleport them. Much like a god of trickery would be expected to do, he tricked them. They're about 100 feet down the very same mountain they were on previously. They have a very long trek ahead of them to get back to civilization. I also added this part on after the episode was written to keep the secret for just a little longer. Thank you for listening to Season 1 of Tales of the Brunch Club. If you've enjoyed the story, please rate and review our first season on iTunes. We don't have a start date yet for Season 2, but starting in January, we'll be posting our new online campaign, Dark Brew Monster Vanguard, on YouTube. The audio for those episodes will be available on this podcast channel, but please come check out the new campaign and other videos on our Rescued by Dragons YouTube channel. You'll get to see our mostly pretty faces and visit us for more Dungeons & Dragons and fantasy content. Thank you so much for listening. Episode 52 was written by Dominic White, Bethany Powers, and myself, Brian Messmer. The audio recording of our D&D game session that inspired this episode will be available on our podcast channel this Thursday under the name Brunch Club Live. Additional role-playing contributions to the story by Bethany Powers, who plays Diesa, J.P. Black, who plays Drusilla, Liz Richard, who plays Alora, Anna Flemke, who plays Salis, and Dominic White, who plays Jory. If you enjoyed the podcast, please help us out by sharing it with your friends and rating and reviewing us on your favorite podcast platform. We really appreciate it. More information about us and Rescued by Dragons and ways to support and follow us can be found at rescuedbydragons.com. Please follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube at Rescued by Dragons and on Twitter at Rescue Dragons for more fantasy-related content and announcements. Thank you once again for listening to our Dungeons & Dragons inspired fantasy fiction podcast.
Can you do a duck call?
Actually,
Trying to.
can you do a goose call?
Can you?
No, I was talking to Alora.
Oh.
She's a ranger, a hunter. She
Oh,
have a good
jeez.
goose call,
Can
right?
I?
Right? They have duck calls. They have
I'll let you roll for this, but I'll also give you advantage if you actually give it your all and try and do a honk.
Well, no, we gotta go to the mouth of the cave.
Let's all go to the mouth of the cave.
Let's all go to the mouth of the cave.
Come on. Alright, you're gonna call
Oh,
a goose.
jeez. Alright, so I'm rolling first? Or am I honking first and then rolling?
Honk first, roll
Oh,
later.
God damn it.
Is that the name of this app? Honk first, roll later.
First love
Yeah.
is now.
Do it. Do it.
So laughing.
I
want to record it.
It is being recorded. Just post it, honk first, roll later.
Oh yeah.
Alright. Take it serious. Alright.
Mm-hmm. Alright.
Okay. Roll hack.
Okay. Good. Enough. You get advantage. Excellent.
Wait. Do you want to try that again after listening to what a goose sounds like?
I almost started to Google it, but I was like, nah.
What is a goose?
Spot on.
Yeah. I rolled a 19.
Yeah.
On the first one.
Yes, on the first one. The second one was an 8.
Hit play for a good time.